This is what appears to be the creator of Celeste. Her own words describing the protagonist Madeline's identity. I literally just came into this moments ago when Eve Anomaly said that one of my favorite game characters was actually trans, and I didn't know that. So now I want to read her exact words. Is Madeline canonically trans? Well, yeah, of course she is. This feels painfully obvious to a lot of, mostly trans people, and likewise it feels painfully obvious to me too in retrospect. It has also become painfully obvious to me that I, myself, am trans. But these are things I was not aware of during the development of Celeste, where I was writing Madeline and speaking from her perspective. Creating Celeste with my friends helped me reach the point where I could realize this truth about myself. During Celeste development, I did not know Madeline or myself were trans. During the Farewell DLC's development, I began to form a hunch. Post-development, I now know what we both are. And my gender identity still isn't all figured out by any means. The Celeste community has wanted clarification on Madeline's identity for a long time now, and I don't blame anyone for wanting that. But the messy realities of my gender identity are coming out have meant that I needed time before I could talk openly about it. The only trans character that comes to mind for me immediately as I'm reading through this is a support character in Cyberpunk 2077. I'm sure there are more before that. I'm sure I know of more, but this is the one that immediately jumped to mind for me. And why I like that character so much is the character's gender identity, their transness, was secondary to their existence in the universe that they lived in. It was not a necessary part of their character. It was anecdotal. It was circumstantial. It was a nice thing to know on top of it. She's a bartender at the bar that you use as kind of a home base for jobs. And you don't get to unlock that piece of information until you're doing one of her side quests later in the game. And it's a throwaway line that a lot of people may not catch if they're just kind of skipping through it. She was talking about her husband, and how her husband was always there for her during her transition. That's the only time it ever gets mentioned in the entire game. And that was one of those moments where I had to put the controller down. I'm like, that's insanely cool. And it's not because I was desperately hoping that there was going to be a transgender character in this game. I was delighted that there was, but it was done in a not heavy-handed manner, and that's what I loved about it. I got to know more about a compelling character in general, and I got to find out more about her backstory and somebody whom I could identify with in that moment. And it wasn't, hey, guess what? We put a trans person in our game. Give us money! Not how it works. Is it an important aspect of her character? Absolutely it is. But it's not a necessary one. It's not one they have to highlight in order for you to be able to empathize with the character. That's why I think it was done really, really well. Much in the way that a lot of us exist in normal everyday life. Yes, there are meaningful moments when it comes down to telling friends and family and people that you have close relationship with. Yes, those are meaningful moments. But for the most part, if I'm in that same role as an NPC in a video game somewhere, I essentially exist in that role for the barista at the coffee shop, okay? Or the person I'm sitting next to at the hockey game. If they ever want to know, surely they can find these things out. But I don't go around handing out business cards that say, hi, my name is Sammy, I'm transgender, you need to know this about me. They don't care. I don't care if they don't care. It's not important. It's important to me, and I am not dumb enough to think that my gender identity is a paramount quality that is on the mind of somebody else, somebody that I just met and will never see again. That's why in the case of Claire, it was done really, really well. If you identify with her character, great. If you don't, great. Was Madeline's transness left intentionally vague in order to make her story more relatable to cis people? This wasn't our intention. Thinking about it though, it begs the question, why couldn't a cis person relate to a trans person? Modern trans struggle might be unique in its details, but it is definitely not alien to the human condition. We are people. Very well said. We go through a lot of the same struggles, day in and day out. Just we have some unique struggles that other people will find it difficult to identify with. When I wrote Celeste, I sincerely still believed that I was cisgender, but I was nevertheless waist-deep in gender feelings among other anxieties. When Madeline looks in the mirror and sees her other self, when she attempts to abandon her reflection, who then drags her down the mountain, when the two reconcile and merge to become stronger and more complete, that was all unknowingly written from a trans perspective. So maybe if you're a cis person and you personally relate to Madeline, you shouldn't feel like we've pulled one over on you. Instead, you could take this as evidence that trans and cis feelings aren't so different, that the chasm between transness and cisness isn't such a wide gulf, and that most of the ways that trans existence is alien to you are the result of unjust social othering and oppression. So, yeah, I kind of get what she's going for here, and it's the same chord that I like to strike every now and again. Like, we're not going to see eye to eye on absolutely everything. That's true no matter who you are. I don't see eye to eye on everything with people in the trans community, people that I identify very closely with. That's okay. Doesn't mean that we don't experience things in a similar enough manner that we can't sympathize or empathize with other people. That's basically what she's saying here. If you got something out of Celeste and now you're thinking that Madeline being trans ruins that for you, I would take that as a sign you have some transphobic beliefs to work through. Here's something that definitely isn't true. The reason trans representation is important is because human beings can only relate to characters who are identical to themselves, and any gains in trans representation comes with an equal loss for cis folks. That's ridiculous, and actually the opposite is true. People need to see and feel the experience of those different from themselves, especially from less privileged groups who they share society with but wield outsized and often invisible power over. Trans folks and other marginalized groups have a lot to teach that will help everyone. If your cis and Celeste help you, that's awesome. That simply means you learn something about yourself from a trans story. Better representation benefits everyone. Well, unless you're profiting off the suffering of trans people, in which case, f you. Okay, that's direct. If your opinions are purposefully infringing on another person's inalienable rights, at least here in the United States, if you are purposefully trying to strip away rights from another individual, that's where opinion starts to cross into marginalization. And that's it. Like, you want to sit here and tell me that the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and the Tampa Bay Lightning suck? Great, I'll listen to you all day. I have no problem doing that. I'll probably get sick of it at a certain point, but I'll listen to your opinion on it. So, for those that don't know, Devontae Smith-Pelly, he used to play for the Washington Capitals, among other teams, but he's a black guy, and he got a lot of hateful language thrown his way, not only from other teams, but from fans. If you want to tell me that, the Washington Capitals suck, great. We can talk about that opinion all day. If you want to tell me that Devontae Smith-Pelly doesn't belong in the league because he is not an NHL caliber player, great. We can have that conversation all day. If you want to tell me that Devontae Smith-Pelly doesn't belong in the league because of his ethnicity, because of a choice that he didn't make for himself, that's bad. That's not a conversation we're having, and that's an opinion that starts to infringe on the rights of another human being. That's what I think the conversations miss a lot of times. Why isn't her transness explicitly confirmed in the text of the game? There is, as they say, a lot to unpack here. I don't know that I have a satisfactory reply to this question that will tie it all up with a bow. The best that I can do is be transparent and help you understand where we were coming from. I don't believe this is a simple question, and there isn't a straightforward answer. We understand that some fans felt hurt by our silence on this after Farewell's release, and I'm sorry for that. It's wrapped up in my personal gender identity, and it's messy. I simply didn't know the words until now. I mentioned earlier that I didn't know Madeline was trans during the development of Celeste, and that I had a hunch when we made Farewell. That was a gradual thing. As time went on post-launch, my personal understandings of Madeline shifted from maybe she's trans to okay, she's definitely trans. We discussed this when writing Farewell, and our conclusion was that we wanted to afford Madeline privacy. That yes, maybe she was trans, but it wasn't really any of ours. That it really wasn't any of ours or the player's business. She's a woman, a human being, and that's all we need to know until she decides that she wants to tell us more. She didn't strike us as a person who would publicly identify as trans, certainly not before the events of the main game. We felt that hints like those in Farewell's ending sequence and on Theo's Instapics account would be more appropriate for her character. I feel conflicted even now while writing this, effectively outing her because it doesn't feel entirely fair to her. It's the same consideration I would want to be shown to me. Okay, I agree with you, but let's also remember we're talking about a fictional character here. But of course, Madeline is a fictional character and we are her authors, exactly as I just said. People have rightly pointed out that there are questions we should consider about what harm might be doing by hiding her identity. But we also considered what harm would be doing by signaling to players that they are entitled to know whether she is trans, and that it is vitally important detail worth agonizing over. Trans people shouldn't be forced to publicly identify as trans in a world that is often hostile to them, and they shouldn't be reduced to their transness. They should be allowed to live their lives how they want, and everyone should be free to explore their gender identity without feeling pressure to place themselves into simplistic categories for the benefit of others. I'll come back to that in just a second. We definitely didn't want it to be a big climactic thing. We didn't want it to be like Samus removing her helmet at the end of Metroid to reveal that, surprise, you were a trans woman all along. That kind of thing just feels like a cheap gimmick in this context. It doesn't feel like it pays enough respect to Madeline, her story, or real-life trans folks, and the scrutiny they endure. We also didn't want to pull a J.K. Rowling and start inserting details post hoc that might feel insincere or forced. Like, sure, whatever you say, lady, Dumbledore is gay. It's convenient that this was never mentioned in the books or carried any weight in the plot. In Celeste, I would argue that Madeline's transness is meaningfully intertwined with her story, but the base game was subtle about Madeline's identity and feelings, in part because I wasn't fully conscious of them, and their metaphorical connection to the gameplay. We preferred continuing that mode of communication over saying, yep, she's trans. A lot of what resonates with me is this idea of forcing oneself to fit into a category so that acceptance will come more easily. And there's a lot of muddy politics and social aspects in play here, and I don't really want to touch on any of that stuff here, but from a broad umbrella perspective, like, I get it. Absolutely, I get it. And it kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier. Is Madeline's trans identity a necessary part, a necessary function of her character in the context of the game? And I don't think that it is. If you're telling a story, you can draw that conclusion, apparently, by virtue of what the game shows you, but it doesn't hit you in the face at the beginning of the game and says, this is a story about a trans person realizing they're trans. Who's going to want to attempt to identify with that when it's given to you right out of the gate like that? And even by her own admission, she didn't even know. So what are you supposed to do with that? I appreciate the depth and the care with which she is approaching this conversation, because it could not have been easy. From where we were standing, it felt like the right decision was a light touch, a nod to everyone who had picked up on it that could allow them to discuss the ways that they identified with Madeline more openly without making a spectacle of outing her. Laura worked with Lena and a few trans friends on the small details that we placed in Madeline's room for the farewell ending scene. People noticed right away to our delight. I didn't notice. Granted, I also didn't actually get the farewell ending because it was balls to the wall difficult. To be clear, we don't believe that explicit trans representation in media is harmful as a blanket judgment. Remember, we were coming from a position of the base game already existing, where I didn't consciously write Madeline as trans, but I was beginning to slowly realize that she and her story were nonetheless trans. Navigating how to address that in Farewell is a very different task to planning from scratch how a character's identity will be introduced and portrayed. We hope that the general takeaway from Farewell's breadcrumb trail could be that trans people can exist and their perspectives are valuable. They can interact with and be relatable to cis people, and it doesn't have to be a big deal. We don't need to know upfront or at all whether everyone is trans or cis, and we hope that our trans and questioning fans could relate to and discuss Madeline's story on their own terms more easily and even feel vindicated. Of course, we underestimated how much anything less than a full in-writing confirmation will be endlessly debated as not enough proof, to which I ask, where's the proof that she's cis? That's fair. I could start over from the beginning of Celeste development, knowing everything about myself and Madeline that I know now. Would I write her differently? Yeah, probably. I didn't go into this game intending to make a trans story, and I would understand my own gender a lot better than I did, that's for sure. But then again, I'm a very different person, and Celeste wouldn't be the same game. For my part, Celeste is about who I was, which includes that struggle for understanding. Heck, if we're time traveling now, I think most trans people would understand if I have a bigger fish to fry as far as getting a redo on major life events with a better understanding of my gender. That'll preach. Celeste is a game written and designed by a closeted trans person who is struggling with their gender identity, scored by a trans woman, with art and code and sound and other labor from their inspiring and irreplaceable friends. These are the perspectives that we approached this form, and I think that the game reflects this beautifully. I would never claim anything that I have ever done is perfect. I do not think we captured and preserved a few pieces of ourselves in a moment, in a time pretty nicely, and Madeline's transness is one part of that. Thank you so much for playing Celeste and for caring about Madeline's story. With love, Maddie. Okay. That is all very cool. I didn't know that. But at the end of it, when I sit and I talk about what I say is healthy trans representation, and this is purely a my opinion perspective. Some people will disagree with me, and that's okay. When we're talking about trans representation in an art form, particularly one like this in video games, I think this is done really well in a healthy manner. Say, yes, is it a journey of discovery? Absolutely. Do you need to know this in order to enjoy the game, relate to the character, empathize with the character, understand the story more? No, not really. I would venture to say it's a flat no, but maybe a 1 to 5% chance of you might relate to it a little bit better if you know. Having said this, I want to go back and play the game just so I can see what those subtle hints were, because I definitely didn't pick up on it the first time. I was more focused on how aggravating and difficult some of that platforming was, to really focus on the character herself and her identity or anything else about her. Which means I was much more invested in the gameplay than the story, but I digress. And I appreciate Maddie and the rest of the developers for putting thought into this specifically and how they detail it to the world. It's important. It's important for people to hear and to understand a different perspective, one that doesn't slap you in the face with it, you know?